Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's session on Going for Growth, Shaping the Future of AI Regulation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker for today's fireside chat, Stephen Almond. As Executive Director of Regulatory Risk at the ICO, Stephen has been at the forefront of shaping and implementing AI strategies within the realm of data protection. At the ICO, Stephen leads the teams that have been charged with engineering information rights into the fabric of new ideas, technologies, and business models as part of the UK's dynamic digital economy, including through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. Prior to joining the ICO, Stephen led a World Economic Forum initiative to promote the adoption of a more agile, innovation-enabling approach to regulation within governments and tech firms worldwide. He previously worked in leadership roles across the UK government, including the creation of the white paper on regulation for the fourth industrial revolution and the rollout of the regulators, the Pioneer Fund, which invested in regulatory sandboxes and similar initiatives to unlock technological innovation. So with a wealth of experience and deep understanding of the complexities involved, Stephen is uniquely positioned to provide valuable insights into the evolving landscape of AI regulation. So you're very welcome, Stephen. I know you've come to us today from another session. Hope it wasn't too stressful getting here, and thanks very much for making the time to be with us today. So turning firstly perhaps to ICO strategy. I know John Edwards spoke recently at a parliamentary event at which he outlined your AI and biometric strategy. Can you perhaps share with us the overarching vision and goals of that strategy and the key priorities that are coming down the line for the next year or so?
Of course. Well, look, thank you so much for having me. Great to see you all. What a time to be alive. I think it's an excellent time to be a privacy professional. There's certainly a lot to keep us busy, and there's certainly a lot to keep us busy in the AI space. You're absolutely right to say that last week we launched our AI and biometrics strategy, which really just sets out our priorities on AI for the next year to come. AI is transforming so rapidly. The ICO has been working to both enable trust and to support innovation in AI for well over a decade. And we have set out just now our plans for the next few months. We've really centered that this time around particular use cases that we're going to take a deep dive into. And before some of you sit there and go, oh, great, he's not mentioned my sector or my area of interest amongst these use cases. The reason we are focusing on these use cases and going deep into them is to draw out the lessons for how AI is developed and deployed more generally. So we are looking, for example, at automated decision-making and how that is used in central government, in areas like benefits, how that is used in recruitment decisions. And the intention there, yes, absolutely, is to make sure that people's Article 22 rights are upheld in those spaces, but it's also intended so that where you are working in financial services, for example, and you're looking at automated decision-making for determining what offers are provided to individual people, for example, actually you're able to translate that learning from these deep dives into those areas. So before I go into these areas, I really want to just stress this is very much a strategy for the whole economy rather than just these three. But in terms of those, so I've mentioned automated decision making. We've also said that we're going to focus very much on foundation models. Those base models upon which so much processing is built, those general purpose models, and making sure that actually how they are developed has real regard to people's rights. We're also looking, I've called it an AI and biometrics strategy, and biometrics is just one face of AI, but it's a particularly sensitive one, particularly because of how intrinsically identifying biometric data is. And so we've also focused on an AI use case around facial recognition technology, focusing in the first instance for ourselves around how that is being used in the police. And through our work to scrutinise, to provide support and guidance in each of these areas, my hope is that we'll provide some really great illustrations of what responsible AI development and deployment looks like that people can be drawing on no matter what sector we're looking at in terms of AI.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The King's speech back in July 2024 talked about potential legislation focusing on, the highest risk AI. So looking at those particular areas that have the greatest impact, which, broadly sounds like, an approach that you're taking in terms of focusing on those high risk areas. To what extent would you, would you anticipate that the ICO might have input into any such legislation? And do you anticipate that the areas it would focus on would be, along the lines of the EU AI Act in terms of those high risk areas or prohibited risk areas, or do you have any sort of insights into that?
So I must admit, I'm slightly loath to talk about legislation just on the day after the Data Use and Access Bill has just passed in the UK. Of course, we're seeing, for those of you who've not spotted it, rumours now a forthcoming comprehensive, I believe the Tech Secretary has described it as comprehensive AI legislation coming forward. But I would not see that as the UK being likely, from my perspective, and this is me as an observer rather than as somebody in government, as likely to be replicating the EU's approach with the AI Act. One of the things that has been really clear through successive governments when they've been setting out their proposals for governance of AI has been that as AI is a general purpose cross-cutting technology that can be deployed and has so many different impacts in different contexts, it's really important to regulate the use cases rather than to regulate the technology. And so I really anticipate in any future legislation that comes forward that same principle will be upheld. The government will actually be looking at, okay, where we are looking at AI in financial services or some of the data protection implications of AI, we'll be looking to fix that within the scope of those regimes rather than trying to create one regime to tackle them all. But that's just as an observer. It'll be for government, of course, to bring forward the legislation.
Yeah, and that sector-based approach is quite interesting, isn't it? And the emphasis on the principles-based approach as well, which kind of calls to a large extent for organizations to have some sort of governance regime that operationalizes those principles and makes sure that they adhere to those broader principles of responsible and ethical AI. In terms of that, governance regime, what are the expectations of the ICO in terms of where organizations should be on that AI governance journey at this stage?
So look, I would say it's going to be different for every organization in this area, but we are finding, and we were just saying just before this panel started, that actually lots of organizations are now choosing to build their AI governance functions off the strengths of their data protection functions. Actually, lots of, whether it's AI that is developed or deployed using personal data or not, actually those same strengths and disciplines that everybody within this room will have in terms of actually having really strong foundations in terms of accountability, really sensible processes for risk assessment, really thoughtful approaches around questions of transparency and explainability and around bias and discrimination. They are all going to be so important as AI is swept into your workplaces, whether or not it's what you're, in a sense, doing for a living, or it's how you're doing it for a living.
And we've seen as well that as part of that, pro-innovation approach that you mentioned earlier, that the UK government has issued its AI opportunities action plan to foster that innovation. So in its enforcement role, how does the ICO anticipate that would strike that balance between, enforcing versus ensuring that pro-innovation approach that's outlined in that UK position?
So look, the ICO has been working, as I said, on AI for the best part of a decade, and it's also been working on innovation for all of that period. It's the push that we are seeing across all regulators around growth. It's not new for the ICO. The ICO, actually, if you turn back to our current strategic plan, which has been around in place for 3 years, sets out that goal alongside safeguarding people of enabling responsible innovation and sustainable economic growth as one of our 4 objectives. And that's really important for us. If we're going to actually achieve true data protection here, it's not going to be just about intervening to stop things from going wrong. It's actually going to be about accelerating and supporting the development of innovation that does things right. And so we take that very seriously. That's why we have a range of different innovation services at the ICO, from our innovation advice service, where you can ask a question on the interpretation of the law to us, and we'll come back within 10 to 15 working days, to our regulatory sandbox for more in-depth testing and trialing, through to, and we said this in our response to the Prime Minister on growth earlier this year, plans for a new experimentation regime to enable people to test things where actually they might in future require some derogations from legislation in order to be able to do that, of course, subject to some of the changes in the legislation that we hope to see in this area. So there's real opportunity to work with us to get AI right in the first instance. And of course, there are repercussions if you don't. We do take that role of scrutinizing the market very seriously. We know that actually it's a role that many people find valuable. Many people will be trying to do the right thing with AI, but they will be worried about being outcompeted by parties who are prepared to cut corners. And it's really important that we at the ICO are prepared to call that out.
And do you see any particular trends or technologies from an AI perspective that will pose specific challenges? So, for example, agentic AI is sort of on everyone's lips at the moment in terms of the new generation AI. Does that pose specific challenges, and how is the ICO dealing with those?
So look, I'll highlight 2, although when it comes to AI, the applications range so many, across so many areas, such that we could be talking about neurotechnology, we could be talking about connected vehicles. But let me pick out just 2. I think on a very short-term perspective, one of the things that we are increasingly worried about is what I might describe as sort of body-based inferences. By which I mean often subjective inferences about somebody's emotional or behavioral state. Is somebody lying? What's their intent? Based on physiological or behavioral characteristics. That's the fancy way of describing it. The shorter way of describing it is snake oil. In as much as actually there is often very, very little evidence of the reliability of these technologies, and we have some real concerns around emerging use cases where we're seeing them being deployed, where, for example, we're seeing people sell those sorts of things that measure the stress or the behavior, or indeed whether or not somebody is lying in an interview. Actually, it's really important that somebody has thought through very carefully the data protection implications in that case. So that's one sort of immediate thing. We're seeing those sorts of use cases emerge. We're quite vigilant around that. Of course, moving into the midterm here, of course, yes, agentic AI will be a real focus area for us. Why have I said midterm? When some of you will be looking at the news and saying, okay, but surely agentic AI is here now. When it comes to governance of agentic AI, I think there's a real question of just how autonomous is that AI? And understandably, in a world which is filled with a lot of hype, we're certainly seeing a lot of agentic AI, which could be close to just being a reclassified chatbot. That's not necessarily the most groundbreaking thing from a data protection perspective. Start to go up those levels of autonomy and to actually cases where agents are taking genuine decisions that would have been taken by humans, potentially involving people's data, and then we start to get into a whole different ballgame.
So again, focusing on that risk, that use case, the potential high impact risk use cases. Yeah. I mean, given the global nature of AI, I mean, there was talk at one point about, the EU AI Act having the Brussels effect. And, given that kind of global piece around organizations needing to put in place responsible AI across different regimes, what are the ICOs in terms of collaborating, on an international basis with different regulators across the board globally?
So look, with AI, it's really important that we collaborate in multiple directions. So yes, absolutely. On the global stage, we've been very active in working, particularly with the G7, with Global Privacy Assembly, for example, to set out early emerging positions and to try and drive, recognizing there will be differences in the underlying legislation, to still try and drive alignment in terms of our approaches, in terms of our principles where we can. So we've set out very proactively. In fact, one of my colleagues is in this room who's been very involved in setting out these sorts of standards, approaches to generative AI, for example. So that collaboration, both in terms of, I suppose, the policy positioning, but also in terms of enforcement collaboration, definitely takes place at an international level. But of course, it's also really important in a world where AI is tripping across different regulatory regimes, that we work together with our other regulatory counterparts in other domains, not just other jurisdictions. So, for example, that we join up with here in the UK, our partners in the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, with the Financial Conduct Authority, for example, with Ofcom, with the CMA, around some of the use cases that cut across those boundaries in exactly the same ways.
And does your advisory service then allow for sort of input from those different bodies? Do you kind of get that kind of cross-sectoral answer, if you like, for someone that's seeking advice on a particular point?
Well, you've stolen the punchline here. So yes, absolutely. We have actually just been running a pilot with our DRCF partners over the last year, where we have been looking at advice requests, in effect, that cut across regulatory boundaries to provide joint responses. That pilot's closed. We're actually just in the process of evaluating it with a very firm intent to replace it with something that's even better, having learned about how that particular one worked. But actually, even before that, the ICO has a range of partnerships to make sure that where you're engaging with innovation initiatives, for example, with the FCA through their sandbox and tech sprints, or with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, around its airlock regime, you can be sure that the ICO is quarterbacking that engagement by providing data protection advice into those areas as well.
That sounds great. And is there, is it worth mentioning some of the other tools and guidances, et cetera, that are available on the ICO's website in the AI space in general?
Of course, look, I mean, there is a real rich repository of information. We do have, for example, not just wonderful AI and data protection guidance, but also practical toolkits, and so to help you identify risks, for example, across the AI lifecycle. We have a toolkit for that. We have in-depth guidance around thinking about explainability. All of that said, there is, and I'm not going to beat about the bush here. There's a lot of it, because we've built this repository up over 10 years, and we're conscious that particularly for some smaller organisations, it's going to be really important that we actually condense that and provide clarity for organisations. So we've actually also committed, and this is set out more in our strategy, to introducing a statutory code of practice here. The government has now just given itself the powers to create that vehicle through the passage of the Data Use and Access Bill. And that will really put in with a little bit more statutory weight our expectations around how to interpret data protection law in this in the space of AI and automated decision making, and hopefully provide that little bit of extra definitive clarity for organisations who are looking for what to do.
And then in terms of the Data Use and Access Bill itself, and what it says about automated decision making, and the sort of more flexible regime that it's introducing, Is the ICO of the view that that kind of strikes the right balance then in terms of innovation versus sort of regulation around that piece in the AI space?
So obviously, we're delighted to see the passage of the new legislation that we'll be taking forward, working on implementation of. You're exactly right to highlight that when it comes to AI, one of the big pieces that the Data Use and Access Bill changes is Article 22, where it changes it from this notion of a prohibition around the use of automated decision making with, I suppose, exceptions, to actually focusing more on people's rights when automated decision making is used. That's going to be a really big focus area for us going forward. So I've talked about the areas that we're going to be looking at in terms of deployment in practice, in central government, in recruitment, but we're also going to be using that to inform updated guidance in this area for organisations, recognising that the law in this area is changing, to set out and provide that clarity around how we're interpreting the new legislation. Watch this space for that now that the bill has passed.
So across all of these pieces, it sounds like there's a real focus on the use case aspect. So, and the risks posed by particular use cases on the basis that they're perceived as posing particularly higher risks, or they're the areas where they're going to cause the most concern, that people are most likely to be concerned about. Would that be fair?
You should expect us to be a risk-based regulator. We are, of course, always going to prioritise the use cases with highest risk, the use cases where we are finding cases of harm. That will be where we will apply our sort of regulatory tools the most. I would say for anybody who's sat there going, oh, well, that's great, I think I'm doing something which is going to slip under the radar. We do class very much as part of harm here, actually, where there is not a level playing field. We look at the economic harm that comes from some organisations going, you know what, actually, I'm gonna coast and pretend that I don't have to comply. So please don't take that risk focus, which is absolutely core to what we do, as meaning that you can perhaps opt out of compliance.
And I guess from a governance perspective, then it makes absolute sense, that there will be some use cases that would genuinely are low risk because they have minimal impact on individuals or group individuals. Whereas then there's going to be, different use cases on that spectrum of going towards the greatest risk. So from a governance perspective, it makes sense to have some kind of process whereby you assess for each use case what the risk is likely to be, how you might mitigate those risks. So very similar to the DPIA process, if you like, but in an AI context, if you like.
Absolutely. I mean, look, let's just return back to our old friend, automated decision making here. How are you as an organization, as AI is increasingly deployed, going to understand where actually it is being deployed and leading to automated decision making if you haven't got great governance of that flow of different use cases, and you're not able to identify which ones are going to start to trip over those thresholds that mean that you have those extra obligations around explainability, around human review, etc. Getting the governance right, ultimately, it sounds far more kind of boring and high level than talking about some of the use cases here, but it's critical to making sure that actually you don't find individual use cases later catch you out because they haven't really been seen by your governance processes. And in a world where AI is entering organizations through many different doors, and sometimes not necessarily through central IT functions, that's even more important.
There are parallels, aren't there, with what privacy professionals have been doing for years in terms of their data mapping, understanding where the data is. It's understanding what AI systems are in place, where they are within your organization, which teams are deploying them or developing them. The excitement around, let's be the first to market with this might happen, somewhere in an engineering team, and it's having that visibility over, I guess, the flows of AI systems within your organization. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think just in the same way that lots of organizations from a privacy and a cyber perspective have very rightly been worried about some of the risks of shadow IT, being brought into organizations. I think we're seeing the same risks emerge with shadow AI. And that's not to discourage those use cases, which can be really beneficial and useful. It's actually just to bring them into the sunlight, to make sure that actually there are the right governance controls around that private information, that confidential information isn't seeping into, for example, third-party tools.
Yes, because we've seen that already in some sort of, highly publicized cases where that's happened in practice, right? So there has been some salutary lessons around confidential information being inputted into some of these, LLM tools, for example.
Absolutely. And, we are in a world where actually the cost benefit for any employee within an organization around this means that it's pretty darn tempting. If you can do your job in half the time by using some off-book AI tools, it's pretty tempting to bring those into the organization and not tell people about them. So thinking about the behavioral instincts around that, getting that right is going to be really important. But it's not just the stuff that's off book. Getting the right governance around things that you're rolling out organization wide can be really important, even if they're just basic off-the-shelf tools. I'll avoid naming a very popular let's say desktop application with a very popular AI element, but I've certainly met organizations that have gone, oh, right, I deployed this popular AI solution as part of my desktop suite. And I found that actually, because our internal controls weren't what we thought they should be in terms of how information was being managed, I was able to ask it questions like, tell me Stephen's pay, or tell me how to find market sensitive information that would enable me to do insider trading in this area. Those sorts of and I'm going to keep on going back to that word, boring governance practices really actually are the kind of the price of doing business in this area, because that's how certainly at the moment we're finding organizations get caught out.
Yeah. And the ICO does recognize that inevitably, for example, in a DPIA context, there will be trade-offs, right? There will be, okay, you mightn't be able to achieve 100% statistical accuracy with an AI system, but actually, depending on the use case, to your point again about the risk, that might not matter. It might not be as important from it's not high risk. So there'll be potentially a trade-off, which may need to be documented, but there is a recognition that within AI systems, that is indeed the case.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, lots of this is context dependent. Let's take the case of accuracy in the context of generative AI. There's different approaches that are needed to that according to the context. If I have a generative AI chatbot that is shooting out incorrect information about me, if it's being used in a creative context and it's actually being marketed as an entirely fictional sort of output that is intended to generate ideas, that's very different to if it is being used in a medical context where you are expecting the exact output to be accurate every single time.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I mean, I guess given the focus on particular use cases and risk, etc., and this focus on areas where there's a perception that that there's a greater worry on the part of individuals about how an AI system will affect them. Is there plans then to or maybe you've already done this, engage with stakeholders, engage with the general public as to where their perception is as to of greatest harm from AI systems?
Look, I mean, this is something that we do on a very regular basis. You can see our own data lives research where we do very in-depth engagement with the public to make sure that we're focusing on areas of greatest concern. Well, we also do it in relation to specific topics. So alongside our strategy, for example, we published a chunk of social research covering areas like recruitment, where we actually got the views of the public around what we focus on to make sure that we're really grounded in what people care about rather than necessarily taking a purist approach to this.
So changing tack just slightly. So just back in May, the Irish DPC issued a statement in relation to Meta AI, in which it outlined the measures taken by Meta to address data protection concerns, and in particular in the context of using data for AI training purposes. And it indicated that it was going to continue to assess compliance by all companies in general in relation to using personal data to train AI. I know the ICO have commented on this issue in the past, particularly in the response to your various consultation series on generative AI. And I know that recently, AI, the ICO asked Meta to review its plans for using data for training purposes. Do you plan to issue further guidance on this point in the future?
So look, I mean, on this one, actually, we were covering this before the IDPC were last year. So we were very clear last year when Meta came forward with proposals to train AI models using data that was based on users of Facebook and Instagram, that we did have some concerns around how that was being designed. We set out those concerns very quickly and swiftly, and I'm very happy to say we also got a quick and swift resolution of those concerns. So we were able to provide a degree of assurance around that actually meant that Meta introduced this model training in the UK some at least around, I think, 6 to 9 months ahead of doing that in the EU, having got that clarity from us around our expectations. And I think that really speaks to our desire as a regulator to be agile in leaning in and fixing problems, and agile in getting out again, and enabling innovation to happen. We are trying to be as open and as responsive as we can be in this space. And you mentioned the work that we've also done in the same vein to produce guidance over the course of last year. Again, before the EDPB came out with its opinion, we ran a series of consultations on how to apply data protection law to generative AI, explaining our views on questions like controllership, on questions just like accuracy, in fact, and set out those perspectives, got some really rich input from different industries, ranging from AI developers through to the creative sectors, and then set out in mid-December last year our own positions, our own final positions on these issues. So in due course, yes, we'll refresh our guidance alongside this statutory code that I've mentioned. But for now, there's already quite a lot of detail there for those who are working with generative AI through our consultation series and response last year, setting out our thinking on all of these issues. I really, it's I can say this because I didn't write it. Some colleagues in this room did write it. It's a really great read. I do recommend it.
Yeah, well, there's lots of guidance on there actually, and even in terms of your risk toolkit, I remember that being one of the early things that you released, and it's it's a great starting point even for a data protection impact assessment to consider some of the the risks that arise, particularly in an AI context, that have an impact on data protection. I think maybe should we turn to the floor for any questions that the audience might have? I think there are there mics somewhere? Yes, thank you very much. So happy to take, I think, Stephen, questions from the floor. If anybody has any questions. Who's going to be brave enough? Yes.
Hi. So just going back to ADM, I've got a question from actually a colleague, and they just wanted to know what the ICO's thoughts on where ADM starts and technology-assisted human decision-making ends. We often see ADM in recruiting, but we struggle to pinpoint a definitive point when technology actually starts to replace human decision-making.
So, and I should probably say this before we dive into further questions. You're not going to get a final legal answer from me in terms of our position on stage today. But what I will say is this is, of course, an area that has been reformed through the Data Use and Access Bill, and it's going to be one of the first areas that you should expect to see guidance from us on. And we know through experience with Article 22 right now that people have questions around, well, actually what in the regulator's view is a solely automated decision. And so you should really expect that there'll be absolute clarity from us around what sits on what side of the line around that. It's an area where we are definitely picking up those questions right now, and we know that people will want to see how we're going to interpret that under the new legislation. But I'm not going to give you the answer on how we're interpreting the new legislation until we've had a little bit more time to respond to the version we got last night.
Any other questions? Yes. Sorry. I think there's a mic coming.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, lovely to hear from you today. Just a quick question. You mentioned about you're able to resolve some of the issues with Meta and the training of the data. Are you able to share how they were resolved, or what was the, or is that?
I'm afraid I'm going to direct you what we've said publicly on this. I'm not going to disclose the commercial conversations around that, but I will say that this is our aspiration, where organizations have set out plans, and in Meta's case it was setting out plans for processing, and we are able to intervene and take action to make sure that people's rights are respected in what is proposed. Then we will do so, and obviously we did so there before the processing took place. Of course, after the processing takes place is a different kettle of fish.
Thank you. Just to build on that, thank you for your work on Meta, because it's very helpful for organisations in Europe to have somebody with the clout of the ICO to be able to intervene on that behalf. Will you be extending that, for instance, to US suppliers of technology which may be used within both the UK and the EU, so that we can have the additional pressure of the ICO to let people know that sometimes we need more information on products than they're otherwise willing to provide, and that we want to be able to use these products to innovate compliantly, but that requires sometimes more information from providers of technology than providers of technology are necessarily willing to supply us with.
I really hear you around this. This isn't AI specific. It's an issue that we find in other technology markets like cloud computing, for example. The challenges of being a small controller working with, in effect, a big processor, although sometimes I will debate what the controllership relationship is really like between the parties there. Of course, as a controller, yes, you have lots of obligations, but you do have, in effect, rights in terms of what you are able to do when you are instructing processes. And we do expect those to be carried through. There are some parts of that we can help with. And if you look at, for example, our generative AI consultation, you'll see a very granular explanation of how we see controllership working across the supply chain and who should be accountable for what. So that's hopefully a really useful resource that you can point people towards in this. But ultimately, when it comes to what are in effect sometimes market power, market choice questions, sometimes on that we get out of the ICO's lane and we get slightly more into the competition and market authorities, competition a markets authority's remit when looking at some of those markets where the power is very concentrated and you might not have that much choice. Of course, where you've got that choice and you can shop around, we do expect you as a controller to be shopping around and making sure that you are choosing very wisely and setting clear expectations with the processes that you instruct.
Comes back to that point about the pre-contractual vendor due diligence, doesn't it? Asking all those right questions. So I guess, again, in terms of templates, people need to be expanding their data protection due diligence questionnaires to consider some of these wider, AI points. Any other questions?
Hello, I have a more like broader question around, we often ask companies to be ready, but do you think regulators are ready to cope with the large volume of questions and fast-paced technological development, especially when there is a requirement to have a cross-governmental departments involvement?
So look, I mean, in many respects, I've described the ICO as having an infinite remit. We survey the use of personal data across the whole economy. That does mean that we regulate well over 1 million organizations. We cannot be everywhere at once. At the same time, we have really honed and refined, I think, over time, our regulatory model to enable us to work very effectively in that space. That means choosing our priorities very carefully, like those high impact use cases that we've talked about in order to make an example. That means horizon scanning to make sure that we know what's coming up next and we're ready to move into those areas. We invest a lot in that in the technology area, publishing a horizons report each year, as well as deep dives into different areas. It also means for us, though, increasingly as the world becomes digital, our regulation must become digital. And that means that we are increasingly investing in automated enforcement tools or automated scrutiny of the markets, away from regulation of AI and looking at regulation of adtech at the moment. We're actually looking at how we deploy AI ourselves in our scrutiny of a very well-established market there, to look at things like cookie compliance and be able to identify and call out bad practices across a market which is very large, where if we worked in analog ways regulating that market, we would, and arguably data regulators have failed in that space. But now there is the opportunity with AI to gain background through being able to scrutinize and be more omnipresent in a way which hopefully doesn't sound too threatening across markets more generally than we ever have before. I thought I might kill the vibe by saying that we're omnipresent.
Just a quick question, Stephen, actually speaking of adtech, because at one point there was a lot of focus by the ICO on the area of adtech. And I think I saw at one point that there was an indication that you would sort of refocus on that area. I think one of your colleagues mentioned that at one point. Is that still on the agenda in terms of priorities to keep that priority open?
Oh my goodness, yes. And not even in the sense of will we be keeping it open? Actually, in January this year, we published our online tracking strategy, doing exactly as we've been doing around AI and biometrics, setting out very clearly our focus areas there in terms of action that we'll be taking. That included saying that we'll be scrutinizing the top 1,000 publishers of the most frequently accessed websites in the UK for their cookie compliance, using automated tools to follow through that, looking at other parts of the ecosystem in terms of where that data is flowing to, and providing guidance on alternative business models that people could move to, such as contextual ads, where we're looking to see if we can lighten the regulatory load through to where people are saying they need to provide something that's it still brings in revenue in a case where the revenues are falling here, opining on the lawfulness of consent or pay models. So lots there. As I say, our online tracking strategy sets out all of that plan. If you are operating in those areas, I very much recommend that you look at that, if indeed you have not already received a letter from us, as those letters have gone out to the top 1,000.
Okay, thank you. Any other final questions? I have one here.
I'm interested in your thoughts around for sort of penalties and things like that around algorithmic disgorgement and the kind of interplay between, you know, how harsh the regulator thinks about that in terms of an entire, like, get rid of the whole thing and start from scratch, or kind of the thoughts around that.
Oh, you
It's
know,
a big question, I know, but
you know a way to a regulator's heart. Look, really fascinating topic here, because I think as data protection regulators move into AI, we're going to see more innovation around remedies. At the moment, the innovation around remedies pretty much stops for many regulators around, okay, well, we'll issue a fine or we'll ask you to delete the data, or both, right? And actually, that's not going to go very far in the world of AI, where actually a lot of the value is in the model that has then been trained. So, of course, then you end up with a whole spectrum of remedies that could evolve in this space that includes, and we've seen it in other jurisdictions, thinking about model deletion at the far end of the spectrum. But then, of course, people will say, well, that's pretty potentially disproportionate here. Surely there's something that could exist in between. And here we start to drift into this interesting world of, well, what are remedies that are feasible, proportionate in this context? To what extent can you have model unlearning? Is it a practical remedy? I think at the moment, we're seeing certainly attempts by some regulators, particularly notably the FTC in the US, to impose these sorts of remedies. I think there is an interesting question, and I'll kind of leave it as bleak at that, as to how feasible these are in practice. And we've not yet tested the views of the courts in this country around the proportionality of some of those sorts of remedies. But I know that we'd certainly at the ICO think quite carefully around how we could demonstrate that in imposing them. But certainly a very valid thing for us to be thinking about in terms of how to ensure that people remain safeguarded beyond just basic model data deletion remedies.
Big issues there. I think we probably have time for a final question, if there's a final one. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question back onto adtech and the ICO strategy. So there was some, I guess, some reporting last year that there would be a certification for digital advertising, and I think it was in collaboration with the ICO. Is that still something that's going to be going ahead?
So in terms of certification schemes, we always welcome the development of certification schemes. They do have to be industry-led and then tabled with us for review. We have had, as a consortium announced last year, a signal of intent to bring that forward, but there isn't yet a final proposal from industry for us to sign off in that regard. So watch this space. I'm certainly always keen to see industry take the reins in terms of trying to embed data protection law and hopeful in that space. But yes, watch this space on it.
Thank you. And actually, one final question for me that you spurred me thinking about it in when you mentioned data deletion. So I'm aware of a joint initiative across a number of regulators to focus on data deletion as a priority. you know, and in particular looking at how that right is exercised and how it's honored. Is that something also that is, you know, a priority for the ICO or something that they're looking at?
So if we just look at the context of online tracking, for
Mm-hmm.
example, we've said one of the things that the center of that strategy is really around giving people meaningful control of their data, and a lot of the focus is yes at the kind of the consent level, making sure that people can give their consent freely, but it's also about making sure that when people withdraw their consent, that is reflected across the ad tech chain. And so one area which hasn't got a huge amount of kind of media pickup, so I'm very happy to talk about it here, is a focus for us is very much actually, how is that signal respected along the ad tech supply chain? How do we have confidence that when somebody withdraws consent, that actually the data that has been transmitted very often to a very large number of parties is simultaneously deleted? We're seeing some technical solutions emerge in that area. The IAB Tech Lab, for example, has proposed a data deletion framework that would enable the enactment of that. But that thinking very much, I mean, if we want to learn the lessons from a space that has been existing for some time, adtech really does have quite a lot to teach us around. If you don't think about how you're going to get data deletion done right up front, my goodness, is it quite a difficult problem to rectify later on when the regulators come knocking.
Interesting. Well, on that note, I think it remains for me to say thank you very much, Stephen. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. You've provided some fascinating insights into the ICO strategy for the next year or so. You know, particularly interesting insights in relation to your focus on particular use cases and high risk use cases, albeit that, of course, you're not discounting other ones. So I think it just remains for me to ask everyone to put their hands together for Stephen and